So my name is Rachel Swadley, and I am the Victim Services Coordinator for the Project HEAL grant here at OTC. Yeah, absolutely. So Project HEAL is a grant that OTC and actually Missouri State also got in October of 2017. And it's through the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. And it's aimed at reducing dating and domestic violence, stalking, and sexual assault on our campuses. So we do a wide variety of things with this grant. We do things like prevention education, so making sure people understand more about interpersonal violence and what that looks like, making sure people know how to intervene in situations that might be harmful, and we do awareness events to just kind of draw attention to the issue, make sure people are aware of what's happening in our community and engaging in conversations about that. And then a large part of what we do, and specifically what I do, is providing services to students who have been impacted by interpersonal violence. So I work with students on our campuses, all of OTC's campuses, whether that's here in Springfield or at Table Rock, Lebanon, Richwood Valley, any of our campuses. So students who have experienced that form of violence, I connect them to resources both on campus and out in the community. So some students might need assistance with things like financial aid or making a connection with the OTC Foundation. Some students might need assistance in their classes. If they're missing classes for maybe they have to testify in a hearing or they're actively fleeing a violent situation, they might need that kind of assistance. And some students might need assistance for things related to off-campus help. So maybe they need to find food or clothing or emergency shelter. Maybe they need an order of protection or they need to make a report to law enforcement. I'm able to also help with those kinds of outside needs. I'm able to go off campus as needed as well. So if a student is actively making a report to law enforcement, I can go with them to that interview. If they are testifying in a hearing or just attending a hearing, I can go with them and be that support person so they don't feel like they are walking through that alone. Yeah, and I'm not an attorney, so I can't give that actual legal advice, but I definitely have walked through that process with several students, and so I can at least say, okay, this is what the next step is going to be. This is the section where you fill out this type of information, or this is the attorney that we can call to get you that legal advice that you need. So it can be a very complicated process, but if people come to like victim advocates or other resources in the community who work within this field, we can make it simpler because we can guide people through that process. I love that question. So instructors are really the front line for interacting with our students on campus. I know my students often share with instructors because they feel like that instructor needs to know the reason why they didn't show up for class or didn't turn in an assignment, or maybe they've built a bond of trust with that instructor. They feel comfortable sharing what's going on in their life. And so our instructors are really that first line of interaction with students. They're more likely to know what's going on in student lives than almost anyone else on campus. And so I really hope that instructors know that there are resources available on campus, whether that's me or counseling or OTC Cares, that really care about these students and want to be there to help when help is needed. And so all the instructor has to do is make that report, make that phone call or email, and let someone else know what's going on so that we can step in and provide whatever support is needed. I know doing what I do, it can be really hard to hear student stories. It's not easy always to kind of hear the experiences that students might face, and so we are not asking our instructors to be counselors or to always hear about the traumas our students face. We have people on campus who can do that work, but we do ask our instructors to respond empathetically and understandingly and connect students to those resources that we have available on campus. Yeah, and that's the kind of the premise of the trauma-informed approach is that sometimes it's easy if a student like isn't showing up to class or isn't turning in assignments, or they kind of zone out in class all the time. It's easy to assume like that student is just like not motivated, or maybe they're lazy, or they just don't care. But in reality, we know that those are also symptoms of trauma. And so that's kind of hopefully something that we can kind of start to train our instructors on. I know I do a training a couple of times this semester on that, is that sometimes we don't need to make assumptions about what is going on in a student's life. Yes, maybe they're lazy, but also, yes, maybe they've experienced trauma. And so, yeah, just responding as empathetically as possible to that student, not making assumptions about what they might be going through, but referring out to help if they need that. Yeah, so there are some different steps to the trauma-informed approach that I talk about when I talk about this approach. Because I think we don't we talk about it a lot, but it's really hard to actually define and kind of put your finger on this is exactly what it is. And so I use a few specific steps. And so one is to realize, and that is just realizing how widespread trauma is. So we know that trauma is going to happen in the lives of about 50% of all of the individuals that we will encounter, which is a huge number, right? That's kind of like, oh my gosh, half of the people I'm going to interact with will experience some form of trauma. So the first step is just to kind of realize how common that really is. And trauma can be a lot of different things. It's not just interpersonal violence. It might be the trauma that first responders face, or that those who serve in law enforcement face. So it can be a lot of different things, but the majority of people will experience that at some point. And then the next step is to recognize what the signs and symptoms of trauma really are. So the signs and symptoms of trauma can be things like I just mentioned, like, not showing up for things that you said that you're going to show up for, or maybe having difficulty concentrating, whether that's at class or at work. That can be things like hypervigilance. It can be physical things like having increased risk of heart disease. There can be a lot of different signs and symptoms that trauma has happened in someone's life. So if we can recognize what some of those signs and symptoms are, then we can better do the next step, which is to respond. So if you can realize how widespread it is, recognize what some of the signs and symptoms are, then hopefully we can respond well and appropriately to that trauma in our community. So we're not all people who can listen to those stories, and that's okay. That's not the expectation. The expectation is that we maybe know at least one person who we can refer to, where we can make sure that that person is still getting some kind of help. Or maybe it's just being that empathetic person who has some compassion and understanding for what they are going through. So responding appropriately. And then finally, it's resisting re-traumatization. So we can't know everything that's going to trigger someone who's experienced trauma. That's impossible. It could be, the cologne of the person sitting next to them. So we can't always avoid those triggers, but we can resist the things that we know might re-traumatize someone. So an example that I like to use is in an abusive situation. A lot of times there is a power dynamic where the abusive partner always wants power and control over the other partner in that relationship. And so maybe they take away their choices. They don't get to go wherever they want or talk to whoever they want. They have to either ask permission or they're told that they can't do certain things. As a college, we are in a position where we might be telling students what they should be doing or who they should be talking to. And so we want to, instead of telling people what to do, we want to give them choices and options. We want to empower them to take control back and make whatever choices they want to make to empower themselves to keep moving forward. So for example, if there's a student who shares something with an instructor that's really personal to them, we want to give them the choice to talk to whoever they want to about their story and their experiences. So instead of just saying, okay, I'm gonna make a report about this and you're gonna walk to counseling right now and talk to counseling, we want to give them a choice about it. Would you like to talk to counseling about this? Are you comfortable with me making this report? Would you like to know who the confidential people are on campus so you can talk to someone who isn't going to make this report, right? So giving them those options back, because the second we take control away, we're potentially putting them in the same place emotionally that their abuser did as well. So it's actively avoiding those things that might re-traumatize them. Sometimes sharing someone's story to multiple departments on campus can be also re-traumatizing because they have to relive that every time they share that story. So we can do things like have Title IX and safety and security and myself all in the same meeting with that student so they can share their story only once instead of to each of those individual departments. I'm really careful when I talk about my students and their experiences not to share anything that might identify them. I keep confidentiality as a really high priority in the work that I do, and so I never want to share anything that would reveal their identity. But I'm more than happy to share some different experiences that students have faced and how kind of OTC has really surrounded them and shaped their story moving forward. So when I was very first hired in 2018 now, it's been a while. I remember one of the first experiences that I had with a student was that student had experienced abuse in childhood by a family member, and they hadn't ever shared that with anyone, but due to another family member coming forward who was a minor about that same type of abuse, the student then had to also become involved in the criminal justice process and make a report and go through the hearing process and testifying process. And so that student was referred to Title IX and then my office. And so we kind of had to surround that student and figure out, okay, what is this going to look like for this student who had experienced this several years ago, but all of it now, all of a sudden, while in college, is being brought back up, and they're having to kind of reface that trauma that they had experienced. And so we made sure that student wasn't penalized in any of their classes for having to go to a law enforcement interview and make a report, or go to a hearing and testify, or even go to a much needed counseling session after that hearing because they needed to process what was going on. So that was kind of step one, was making sure that student wouldn't suffer academically for what they were going through. That is kind of a big barrier to success in education, are those interpersonal things that happen outside of the campus, those forms of violence that students experience outside of the campus. And we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to help students be successful despite those barriers that they face. So that was kind of step one. And then step two was that I actually got to go with that student to that law enforcement interview and to those hearings, and as that student was testifying, as that student got an order of protection. And so that student then was able to receive kind of consistent care throughout that process. At least one person was by that student's side and cheering them on and encouraging as they went through and helping them process afterwards. We know that a lot of people don't testify and don't want to go through that process because it is hard. It is really difficult. But if they have a person who is walking beside them through that, they're going to be much more likely to be able to succeed through that process. And so the success of that story is that person was convicted of that abuse, and that student was able to graduate from OTC and transfer to a 4-year college. And so we got to really see that student through that really difficult time and make sure that they were still successful despite those barriers that they were facing. So that's one example of a success story. Not all stories go like that. Sometimes successes are really different for students who are experiencing these forms of violence. So I'll share another story. There's a student who I was working with one spring semester, and that student reached out to me and said that they were potentially ready to leave an abusive situation. And so we did all of the kind of prep work that goes into that. We created a safety plan. We talked through, okay, does this student want to make a report? Do they want to file for an order of protection? What are they kind of looking for here? What does safety look like for them? So we made these plans, and then I kind of lost contact with that student. I sent several reach outs and I wasn't getting a response. I never really knew if they had left the situation or not, but I assumed since they lost communication that most likely they had not left that situation. Several months later, I ended up hearing back from that student that they were ready again to leave that violent home, that violent situation. And so once again, we did all of the prep work, talking through what does leaving look like for you right now? What does safety look like for you right now? What steps do you want to take? And so we went through the process. I helped that student get connected with an attorney, helped them file for an order of protection, talked them through the safety plan, and that student did end up leaving that violent situation. And so that's one example of how sometimes at first, even though we're helping these students, it doesn't always look like we might hope that it looks like. They might not always leave, and that's okay. That's not my choice. That's their choice. And I will respect and support any choice that a student makes. Hopefully we can still plan for safety even if they stay within that violent relationship. But if we stick with it and hopefully maintain as much contact as we can and just be there whenever the student is ready, hopefully we can still help them find that safety and healing from that situation. And so sometimes our students have to, when they do leave, they have to flee the area and go to a different area. We've actually had several students have to do that this semester, is leave whatever campus they were on and go to a different area in order to get safety. And so thankfully, most instructors are willing to work with those students as they are fleeing those violent situations, so that whenever they are able to re-engage with the class, that they can continue their education. We know that one of the biggest barriers to someone leaving an abusive situation is finances. It's financial dependence on the abuser, which a lot of times the abuser creates intentionally, so that the person feels like they can't leave. OTC is a lot of students' way out. They're getting an education. They're able to get quality jobs after their education, which allows them the financial freedom to leave. And so sometimes being able to obtain their education here at OTC is what makes the difference for them in being able to successfully leave that violent environment. Yeah, so that's something that I actually customize to every student who I work with. But the basic idea is that it's thinking through, this is what a student's strengths are, and this is what a student's vulnerabilities are. These are the ways that they might be unsafe. And it's kind of thinking those things through and building a plan so that just in case the worst case scenario happens, and I like to tell students it rarely does happen, but just in case it does, we've already thought everything through. We've already planned it all out so that in that moment, if a crisis is occurring, they're not having to think through what do I need to throw into a bag, or where's the closest escape route, because we've already thought all of that through and they already know what they're going to do. In moments of trauma, when our fight or flight response is kicking on, the logical part of our brain shuts down completely. I don't know if you've ever experienced a moment where someone scared you, but you probably reacted instantaneously without thinking about what your reaction would be. And so that's what happens in these moments of trauma. We react, we don't think, because that part of our brain is shut down. So the safety plan allows them to have already thought it through. They can just react because they already know what their reaction is going to be. So as an example of something that we do for a safety plan here on campus is we have students think through, okay, when you're pulling into the parking lot, are you parking close to an entrance or exit? Are you parking where there are security cameras that could catch any kind of behaviors coming from abusers? Are they walking in hallways where those hallways are usually empty or they are dead ends, to make sure that someone doesn't get kind of stuck in a space where there's no escape? To think through, okay, here's safety and security's number. Please put it into your phone and save it, so that if you do need to call them quickly, you're not having to, go to OTC's website and look up what's safety and security's number. So it's kind of thinking through logically, okay, here are the places where you might be unsafe. Here's what we're going to do about it to make sure that you are as safe as you can possibly be. Obviously, it doesn't guarantee safety. Ultimately, that is a person's choice to either harm or not harm someone. But safety plans usually do empower survivors or victims because it makes them feel like they have a little bit more control over their environment and over their safety. Yeah, absolutely. So I am definitely a person who when students are going through these journeys, I am with them every step of the way. But me on my own, I am not enough for a lot of times what students need in these situations. A lot of times they do need that financial aid support or OTC Foundation support or Title IX support or the work with for their instructor to work with them. So all of these different departments on campus, the tutoring and learning center needing some tutoring to get caught back up in classes, right? All of these different departments on campus can have a role to play in the student getting back on track and succeeding academically. I'm able to help them more with kind of the resources that are needed outside of campus, and I've got my networks and a community of support outside of OTC, but even within OTC, we really need so many departments to be involved and actively engaged in the process of supporting these students, and they are actively involved. I know that we all kind of have these working relationships where I've got my people in financial aid that they probably hear from me once a week where I just type up an email and say, hey, can you answer a question about either this student's financial aid situation or this hypothetical situation? And so I really rely on everyone here at OTC to help these students as they face these situations. That reminded me, even with our awareness events, we try to do things where we have people actively participating in something like writing a sticky note of an encouraging thought to survivors, or submitting a note of encouragement to an artwork that we are putting together, or writing something encouraging on a worry rock, right? And so even those little things like that, so even if you aren't through working in a department where you might actively need to help someone, that's another way that we can, surround our students with that support, is even just by, they walk by a piece of artwork in my office and they see, oh my gosh, there are 50 or 100 people who have written a note of encouragement that could be for me, right? So even just that, those small little ways that we can communicate, hey, OTC is a place that cares about our students and what they're going through, can make that student feel like they're surrounded in their community with that support. Oh my goodness, I love those events because anytime someone walks up to the table, I get to interact with students in a really positive way. With my job, it can be really discouraging just to see the level of violence that's happening in our community. But when I have those events and I get to see people and they are supportive and actively engaged and wanting to be a part of it, that makes my job so much easier because I know there are people who are caring and want to do something about it. When we do preventative events, it makes me feel so hopeful that there are people who are learning the information they need to make sure that they aren't in those types of relationships, or can get out of those relationships if they need to, or they can step in when they see a situation that might be harmful. So yes, anytime I get to see kind of the prevention aspect or the community engagement aspect, that is so exciting and encouraging for me.